Well, welcome back to the Azure Podcast. This is episode number 449, being recorded on the 7th of December, 2022, with special guest Reza Rahman. I'm Sajid, and on Teams with me, we have, of course, our special guest Reza, who we're going to get to in just a minute, and also my colleagues Kale and Evan, who are joining me on the podcast today. And before we turn the mic over to Reza, let's cover some news in the Azure space. I believe Kale and Evan, you had some tidbits in there, and I had one as well. So,
Go ahead, Cal.
Kale, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I got three of them here today. First one's about the speech to text accuracy with Azure Custom Speech. So we've had folks from the cognitive services on here a few times talking about the different services. This one's specific to the speech to text. There's also been a lot of news about this GPT chat thing that's going on the internet.
Just a little.
A little bit. But anyway, it's a good write-up here about the service itself and some of the milestones that they've reached with reaching human parity in 2016 and some of the other things that have come along with the word error rates and things like that. So if you're interested, it also has some customers who are using this, including Peloton, who people know from the exercise bikes and other equipment that they have. So pretty cool thing. It also talks a bit about the responsible AI bit around that. The second one I had is around, and I don't know much about this partner. It might be cool to, kind of delve into this a little in the future here is, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, so I apologize if I mispronounce it, but Isovalent, who's basically bringing some new things to the cloud with this new backplanes that they have for their service. And essentially, these are very Kubernetes based. So the AKS has a preview feature out to use CNI with their open source backplane with these folks, as well as the container marketplace has some images up there or some offerings up there that you can use with it. Again, don't know too much about these guys. I don't know if anybody else has been using this, but it seems like it's very early, like a preview feature, but tight integration into our backplane in Azure. And then the last one is on cost management. I talk about these from time to time because it's something everybody has to kind of deal with, especially at a large enterprise. And new features up there. This is the one for November, but basically some new preview features, tag inheritance, things like this. So basically how you can group your resources and how they show up on your bills and some of the dashboards that you have there to help you better rationalize your costs in the cloud. And there's a bunch of some new things around virtual machine sizing and some cost analysis pieces that they've been upgrading. So those guys continue to keep cranking out updates on that. It's super awesome. And take a look.
Yeah, great. The two that I wanted to call out today, and this one, it sounds trivial, but I know there's a ton of complexity here. But we've announced a public preview for the Azure SQL trigger for Azure Functions, right? So if your data changes, it'll trigger a function, which there's got to be some sort of polling mechanism and whatnot in there. But again, lots of people want to be able to trigger actions based on when something happens in their data. So I think this is a great step in that direction. The other one, and it occurred to me when I was putting this in our show notes, I don't think we've ever had the Azure Communication Services team on. I think we'll probably need to rectify that at some point. But they've added some capabilities around automating calls when they come in. So sort of some IVR type capabilities, where somebody can say, pick up, option number 2 and it triggers this, and hey, it can go off and trigger an email or a chat off of that response, right? So just some capabilities to automate the flows that are coming through that communication service.
That's good. Yeah. And I just one and kind of related to what Kale was talking about in terms of bringing the cost down. How about a cost of 0? Okay.
It's not like a car salesman there, because
Well, it turns out we have Azure has a number of services that are free, right? And some of them are free for the first 12 months. So like the virtual machines and all that, I think you get the first 12 months free storage, managed disks. But then there are some that are free forever. which is really interesting, right? And I was surprised at the ones that are free forever. App service, if you have like it's a small website, you can have 10 of them for free. Azure Cosmos DB is now for free for the first 25 GB and 1,000 RUs. Azure Functions, Event Grid, even AKS is free. They have a small version of AKS you can stand up.
It's a function of like what your compute usage or your request rate, right? There's some scale factor that goes into that, right?
It's normally the number of requests that you put in the entire month, or the number of requests you send in every second. It's throttled a little bit, but if you just want to kick the tires, Azure Dev Test Labs is free. Azure Logic Apps, Bot Service. I mean, you could stand up pretty much anything you want, just to play around with these free services. And they've enhanced it recently. So I'm going to put a link to this in the show notes, so our listeners will remind themselves that they can use Azure for free. All right. Well, having said that, let's get our special guest, Reza, back on the mic here. Reza, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Please give our listeners an introduction about your background, what you do at Azure, what your passion is, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciated, all of your time here, and hopefully today I can reach a little bit of a new audience that I typically don't reach, which is an accomplishment on its own. So yeah, my name is Reza. In my day job, basically here at Microsoft, I'm principal program manager for Java on Azure. In theory, what that means is, I'm responsible for all of our Java customers on Azure. And as we all know, there's many different bits and pieces of Java that occur at Microsoft, and essentially, at least in theory, my job is to ensure all of that work is essentially customer oriented and we have the correct product truth, product quality, and so on. So aside from that broad-based charter, I also have a specific area that I'm responsible for, and obviously maybe we can spend a little bit of time talking about that today. And that is an area that historically Microsoft has not been that strong. I would say obviously we've not been that strong in Java in past years, and especially not strong in the particular area that is my specialty. And that is sort of enterprise Java workloads, or Jakarta E workloads for short. Shorthand for that, maybe folks over here would be more familiar with, is the so-called, if you will, old, if you want to use that word, runtimes like
classic.
WebSphere.
We'll go with classic.
Classic, sure,
classic.
or traditional. Traditional is a better word, I think. So traditional Java runtime. So this would be WebLogic, WebSphere, and JBoss EAP, and enabling those runtimes on Azure. Now you might be thinking, why would you want to do that? The reality is the Java ecosystem is old, right? And sometimes being old is not really a very, very bad thing. What that means is there's a lot of mission critical applications that still run on these runtimes. Anecdotally, what we see in Azure Java customers is as much as a third or a quarter of these workloads are still running on these traditional runtimes, right? So these runtimes do need to move to the cloud, and an answer is not always, hey, you must rewrite your app to move to the cloud, right? That's, for many customers, that's not a practical thing they can do or even want to hear about. So, we do need to put in work to enable pathways such that these runtimes can also move to the cloud. There's another newer runtime that's sort of the next generation of the same technology family, Jakarta. It's called Quarkus. And Quarkus has a few things that are very similar to it. But basically, we are also looking to enable Quarkus, perhaps in the next few months, to also enable Quarkus in the same way on Azure as well. So that essentially it's about keeping up with the Java ecosystem, its past, present, and future, and making sure that Azure is a platform that is a good place for all of those type of workloads and all of those type of customers.
I think you sort of raised a really good point, Reza, in that historically, while you could do Java in Azure, I go back far enough. I did some JDBC, and I remember being like one of like 4 people, right, in the company that knew anything about JDBC in the support world. You could do it, but it just wasn't supported. It sounds like what you're talking about is us, really making it integrated and easy, and sort of all the things that we do for .NET or Python or some of these other languages that are out there as well. Is that sort of the direction that you're talking about?
Correct. So interestingly, when I came on board, which has been actually quite a few years now, interesting statement. We're in a podcast, right? We can keep the conversation interesting. Interesting conversation that when I came on board was, oh, we don't have any Java EE workloads. I was like, that is impossible, because if you're running the second or third largest cloud in the world, and you've been in business for a little while, there is no way you do not have Java EE workloads. You do, you probably just don't know about it yet.
Yeah.
So yes, it's exactly right. I mean, in theory, do we need to do the work that we are doing? Yes and no, right? A customer at the end of the day, if you just give them generic infrastructure like AKS and ARO or virtual machines, can, with time and effort, figure all this stuff out. But why would they do that, right? When we can do much better.
It's infrastructure, right? There's no value in that for them.
Sure. Yeah. So there is ways that many things we can do to improve that experience, even at the end of the day, and we can talk about all the offerings that we have, right? Our offerings isn't all about necessarily virtual machines and AKS. We do also have a PaaS offering for Jakarta developers. But aside from all that, even in the world of AKS and ARO and virtual machines, there are definitely things we can do to make that experience much better and less sort of do it yourself, if you will. So that is basically what we're in the business of doing, and we do this work not simply by ourselves, but we actually partner with the ecosystem to do all this work. So if we're doing work to enable WebLogic, we're doing that with Oracle. If we're doing work to enable WebSphere, we're doing that with IBM. If we're doing work to enable JBoss AP, well, we better be doing that with Red Hat. So yeah, it's also a bit about sort of bringing, thinking of ourselves as a platform and enabling a whole bunch of important Java players that produce these runtimes into the ecosystem as well, and sort of making all these platforms a first-class citizen, into the platform.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, maybe you could comment on, like, I think it's always like a hard thing to say how deep are we gonna like integrate these things, right? Like on one respect, it's like we can make it super easy and like almost single click for somebody to do something, but then the people who are doing like really advanced workloads can't use that as much, right? Because they need to tweak something or whatever, and then they want to get in the weeds there. So I always find that's like an interesting challenge. Like, how far do you go, or how do you set up that offering so it caters to both, right? The novice and the advanced,
Exactly. So we recognize this early on. So, the way we started this work a few years ago is actually answering that question of, oh, we don't have any Java EE customers. So we actually did a survey of almost 200, an interview series of almost 200 in Azure customers, many of which, again, numbers play out about a quarter to a third are using these workloads. We also did a more formal study of about a couple of dozen customers. And yes, there is, when it comes down to the cloud, in general, when it comes down to solving infrastructure problems in the data center, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? So even if you are a WebLogic, let's say, a good example would be JBoss, right? So even if you are a JBoss EAP customer, not every single customer wants PaaS, right? Some do, right? That fits their organizational philosophy and the way they generally want to be doing things, and perhaps the nature of their workload. But not everyone does, right? Some other folks are container first, and so that is their organizational philosophy, and that's where they want to go in the future. So we need to enable that pathway even for JBoss AP, WebSphere, and WebLogic. Similarly, other organizations and workloads simply aren't even ready to take a look at even containers. And really, the most comfortable and sensible path, at least in the short term, for them is virtual machines. So we do need to enable, all of those pathways. And in fact, this is what we do. If you look at, in the show notes section, there's 3 resources listed out there. One of which is a little talk that I try to deliver, talking about, hey, this is what we're doing for Jakarta developers these days. It actually starts with, mapping the pathways of, what are the different pathways into the cloud. The 3 major ones being the one we talked about, and then, what runtimes specifically are you enabling for those individual pathways? So it's a worthy I think, slide deck to at least breeze through.
Reza, one of the things I always wonder is when we try to bring in these legacy platforms into Azure or into any cloud for that matter, they were obviously never made for the cloud, right? They were made for an on-premises world, and I'm wondering, what sort of effort was that to kind of put that? Was that like you're trying to push like a square peg in a round hole kind of effort, or did you have to make changes, to the underlying frameworks, work with some of the vendors, for example, to change some of the underlying code to make it more cloud friendly? I'm just curious, what was that experience like? And then we can talk about what the customers have to go through to also onboard their applications into that offering in Azure.
Right. So bear in mind, yes, obviously there's truth to the statement that yes, these runtimes weren't really designed for the cloud, right? When they originally came about, they were intended mostly for on-premise setups because that was the norm back then. Of course, newer runtimes like Quarkus that are like only 3 or 4 years old, that's no longer true. Those design assumptions are in fact made for the cloud native runtimes. Same is true for the fundamental technology that we're talking about behind these runtimes as well, right? So the Java EE platform before J2EE, its predecessor J2EE, Java EE, up till perhaps even Java EE6, these were essentially technologies optimized for on-premise deployments. But even at a technological level, right? So these platforms and specifications themselves have reimagined themselves and reoriented themselves to cloud native development, right? So these days, what would be more relevant for something like Quarkus, for example, would not necessarily be the full Jakarta EE full profile, but rather the Jakarta EE core, which is oriented towards cloud native development, as well as microprofile, which is another related family of standards that are, again, oriented towards cloud native use cases. So the same, I think the same applies with these runtimes as well to some extent. So every single vendor has a different answer, right? So Red Hat, IBM, and Oracle have different answers to how they are sort of reinventing themselves in the cloud environment. Very briefly speaking, and this is probably a deeper conversation that is difficult to do justice to, but I'll very briefly give you the outline. So WebLogic's WebLogic answer is basically to adapt WebLogic in a containerized environment. So they have, for example, they've developed specific operators and toolkits that target AKS in particular. Right? So for VMs, it's more or less the same story as you would on premise. So yes, are they cloud optimized? Probably not. Can they run in the cloud? Yes. And we do some work to make that easy. The WebLogic AKS capabilities are a little bit more cloud oriented, right? More so than VMs. What is IBM story? The IBM story is, yes, you can move the WebSphere traditional runtimes largely as is into VMs. Again, we're developing capabilities to do that. If you want to be a bit more cloud native, the answer actually is to move from WebSphere traditional into either WebSphere Liberty or Open Liberty, which is the open source upstream for WebSphere Liberty. And that is truly a cloud native runtime. Right? It's a modular, it's lightweight, it's memory efficient, and so on. It has microprofile capabilities built into it, so on and so forth. So if you want to do containers and you're in WebSphere land, your canonical answer is probably to move to Liberty in some shape or form, and then Liberty is enabled in AKS and Arrow. In terms of JBoss EAP, the answer is very similar, right? So it's still the same runtimes, but there's different flavors of JBoss EAP. So JBoss XP, for example, is more modular and is more geared towards containerization. So whereas you can use JBoss EAP on VMs, and we do work to enable that, we also do work to enable JBoss EAP on ARO or Azure Red Hat OpenShift, and that is more geared towards JBoss XP. And also, again, there's capabilities built in like operators to make that runtime far more container native. And of course, if you want to go a step beyond that, we also have JBoss AP on App Service, which is, as we know, App Service is basically our premier tier PaaS offering platform, and we basically have worked with Red Hat to enable that. So if you want a fully PaaS-based experience, fully PaaS-based look and feel and performance, and rather sort of behavioral aspects, you would move to JBoss AP and App Service. So yeah, each vendor's story is slightly different, but in general, if you were to, at a meta level, basically these technologies are evolving, because of their own customer pressures and customer needs. They're evolving these specifications to make them more cloud friendly, even though these runtimes originally weren't intended necessarily for the cloud. Evan, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah,
not to use that internet
Teams
cliche
and I
these
are
days,
not.
but
Teams has a challenge with my mute button. It likes to take me off right when I go back on. We're talking about the run times, and I think that's that's the starting point. But anybody that has an app that's running anywhere, it's gonna, even one that's been around for a long time and you're not planning on investing a lot in, you're gonna make small changes. And so it feels like there's the runtime, but then there's the broader, can I use Java to talk to, service bus? Can I use Java to talk to functions? And there's that whole side of the story as well. Is that where we're investing as well, beyond
yes,
just the runtime?
of course. So enabling the runtimes in a way that it makes sense for
That's sort of the
that
baseline,
particular,
right? You got to start there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the baseline, and I think we're in good shape there. I think, if we can toot our own horn, I think in terms of what we've done, I think we're in a better position to enable these workloads than maybe some of our competitors are, right? Because haven't invested in the work that we're doing and haven't invested in building out the partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the runtime, moving the application itself is only the first step, right? So typically, if you're in a cloud migration journey, it's migrate and then optimize. So yeah, we are absolutely also investing in making sure that each of these runtimes can talk to Azure, sensible set of Azure services. Obviously, database is an obvious one, right? So we enable actually those things into our work already, because that's just it's almost table stakes.
Yeah.
Same thing with sort of cloud native load balancing capabilities. So we make sure all of these things work with things like App Gateway, and Azure Load Balancer, all of our sort of cloud native, load balancing capabilities. Beyond that, obviously, there's things like consolidated logging, via App Insights, monitoring via App Insights, and a whole host of other things, all the way up to, let's say, Cosmos DB, even basic things like, using Azure Key Vault to sort of populate, the secrets or sensitive information into these applications. Yes, so it is a more holistic journey. It's not just about moving the runtimes, but also, moving the runtimes in a way that they can make use of the cloud, right? That is fundamentally what we're doing. Arguably better, cheaper, whatever we want to call it. Better qualities of things that you wouldn't have in your data center. So absolutely, yes, we are doing both of those things. We're making sure that the runtimes can actually move in an efficient and productive way. And then once they do move, they can actually better leverage the cloud capabilities that perhaps wasn't there in an on-premise environment.
I used to recall that we used to call these things clusters when we ran them on premises, right? Like a WebSphere cluster or WebLogic cluster. Yeah. Is that how we refer to them when they move to the cloud, or have you given them like a new naming convention there?
No, it's exactly the same paradigms. They're 100%. They work exactly more or less the same way. That is, in fact, what the secret sauce there is. The operators. So when you have a notion of running a set of coordinated instances of JBoss AP or WebLogic in a containerized environment, the thing that forms the cluster, and it's still in fact called the cluster, is actually the operator piece. That's in fact one of the things that it is doing. So from the perspective of a customer, it's not a whole new world, right? A lot of the paradigms are essentially more or less the same, right? Otherwise, you won't be able to move those applications so easily. But it's just running in a more cloudy way, if you will.
Cloudy way.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, so if I'm a developer, let's say I'm an architect in a bank, and I have my critical banking software running on an EE cluster, and I want to move that to Azure, like what sort of the broad steps I should consider to make that transition over to the cloud?
The steps are more or less so. Our objective is to make the steps more or less the same as you would in any workload. So first thing is you need to understand what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and what kind of resources do you have? What are your timelines precisely, etc. So in other words, what are your business drivers? So once you do that, and you go through an analysis, the answers that you need to come up with is like, okay, so am I staying with this? Am I taking more of a lift and shift approach, and it's mostly the same application and same runtime? Or am I going to go through some modest modernization efforts? Let's say I want to containerize these applications, which is not going to be a zero change, right? So there is going to be some change involved, and depending on your objectives, that may be the right thing. Yeah, or you may be thinking about re-platforming, right? So essentially rewriting some portion of your application to use a different runtime, let's say. Let's say you want to move from WebLogic to JBoss EAP or so on, or whether you want to go from a monolithic application to a microservices-based application. So perhaps a move from, let's say, WebSphere Traditional into WebSphere Liberty, but also rewriting your application to essentially re-architect it. So that's one level of decision. So, what are you really trying to do and how do you get there? Then you have to choose, okay, so what is a sensible destination on Azure? And also similarly, so in other words, are you going to move to VMs? If you're lift and shift, most likely yes. If you're not looking to rewrite and modernize a little bit, most likely AKS or some combination thereof. If you're really wanting to move to PaaS, and perhaps app service for JBoss EAP is the answer for you. Then you have to go through a prototyping exercise of can you actually do that? Then you have to determine, okay, I've moved my app. What about all my infrastructure? Am I going PaaS? So similar sort of, same iteration for each of those pieces, whether it be data or monitoring or what have you. Then, of course, you need to go through the actual implementation and operationalize and cloud optimize and so on. So it's a whole big journey, but fundamentally, I don't believe it's so different than moving anything to the cloud. I assume if you have a database workload, you would basically go through some combination of the same sort of considerations.
I think we touched on it earlier that you want to give people flexibility in terms of IaaS or AKS or ARO or whatever you want, whatever they want to do, we want to meet them there. But I was looking at some of the documentation before we started recording, and it looks like even if you want, like VMs is sort of the all the bells and whistles in terms of configuration, but it looks like you don't have to start with a bare VM, right? It looks like we've actually invested in building, working with these partners to have marketplace images, because that's where people make mistakes, right? Is the right way to configure it on the VM. And it looks like we've even invested in making sure that happens successfully, right? Give them that very first step on the on-ramp, make sure that looks right.
Absolutely. So yeah, part of the work is, again, longer discussion probably wouldn't have a whole lot of time on this, so I'll describe it very briefly. So yes, the classes of things that we do is a marketplace solution that makes the initial setup very easy. So, automates the most, sort of sensible
Load
things on Azure.
All that kind of stuff that you can mess up.
Load balancers, databases, virtual machines, your VNet setup, so on, all of that is automated for you, storage, so on. So the sensible things that you would need in a sensible way for that particular runtime, you don't have to do all of that to yourself. It's actually all behind marketplace solution templates, co-developed with these vendors. That answer is not always right for every single customer. Some customers, it's too much automation for them, and they really want to be doing everything by themselves. So cater to those cases, we do also have what we call essentially manual guidance. So the same thing that the solution templates do, but basically telling you exactly the steps that you need to follow to do the same thing. So okay, this is what went into the sausage making, right? I'm going to do all of the steps by myself, whether it's Terraform or however I want to do it, and I don't want all this automation. So we also meet that use case as well. Obviously, beyond that, as we talked about, we also have integration guides. That's another class of things that we do. Above and beyond what we do, the basic automation level. Hey, do you want to use Azure Service Bus as your messaging provider in your JBoss AP application? Well, this is how you do it. You want to use Azure Active Directory as your OIDC provider in your application? Well, this is how you do it. So on.
It feels like a never-ending list. I can imagine your
Yes.
backlog and your list of things that you want to
Yes.
go make easier. It probably never shrinks.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. Yeah, but at the same token, we are a customer-driven company. We don't, try to boil the ocean all at once. We do things. This is why the last piece, that I'll also share in the notes. That's a good segue for me to mention that. So we do have a mechanism by which, because we're so early in this journey, we do want our own field and our customers to be able to work with us very closely and, give us feedback on the work that we're doing. Say, okay, this is what's working, this is what's not working, and also allow us to discover what their needs are that we don't either know about or we haven't correctly prioritized, right? So there's a form you can fill out. You can get in touch with my team, and we're here to help you with their migration journey. And help you understand our offerings, help us understand your workloads. So we're very much looking forward to that as well. Hopefully that's a good call out. So this is how we actually go about sort of prioritizing that endless list, right? We work with the customer and say, hey, this particular customer has this thing that they need to unblock, and hence that is what we'll prioritize working on. There's also as a reference, there's a handy page that we have. It sort of talks about all of our Jakarta and Azure offerings. That's on the link as well. So if you want to dig in a little bit deeper to find out what all the offerings are, that's the place to go.
Great, awesome.
That's great, Reza. Thank you so much for kind of answering all our plethora of questions over here and helping our listeners also understand the offerings that your team has put on Azure, which is quite impressive, actually. I'm looking at that webpage, which has all of the EE and Jakarta EE offerings, and there are a lot of options here. So thanks for sharing that. We'll look forward to you getting a lot of feedback from our listeners on that survey link, and maybe we'll have you again sometime in the future if there is some more updates or enhancements to these offerings that you would like to talk about.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, absolutely. There's one thing that I'd like to accomplish out of this, is to hear from more folks. By the way, you don't have to fill out the survey, so certainly for Microsoft folks, just pull up Teams or pull up your email and, look me up and send an email. And that's a lot easier than filling out a survey with like 15 questions. So aside from that, thank you for having me. Would love to come back. We do have a significant work stream. One idea could be that, I talk to you specifically about each of our work streams, right? So what are we doing for WebLogic? What are we doing for WebSphere family? What are we doing for JBoss AP? Potentially a few months later, what are we doing for Quarkus? And what some of our customer learnings are? We're happy to share all that with you.
I think we should do the call out to the audience, right? As this will go out in a few days, sort of to our listeners, as you hear this, if you want to hear a deeper dive on one of these specific engines, right? We'll absolutely raise it. We'll definitely
Which
take you
one
up on
would it
that.
be?
So we'll let our audience certainly vote with their fingers for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Right.
Cool.
Great. Thank
Awesome,
you,
Reza.
Reza.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you for having me.